right, good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and take a look at how to work with React hooks. You know, hooks have been around since February of 2019, and now it's November of 2019 as an actual production feature in React. And as I've been teaching some recent React classes, I've been a little bit surprised that more of my students who have some React experience haven't embraced them more. I actually had a class a couple of weeks ago where students were even pushing back a little bit and wanting to use class-based components. And so I have a feeling a lot of that is just because there's some confusion around how hooks work, why do we need to learn a new API, what are the benefits of using hooks. And so what I wanted to do here real quick this morning was I wanted to just do a very simple kind of demonstration of a benefit of using hooks within a React application. Just kind of get right to the heart of the matter and show you at a very practical level. And so what we're going to do is we're going to come into here and create a new React app. We're going to say npx create React app, and we'll just call this one our hooks demo. Now, the only hook we're going to look at here this morning is actually the state hook. There's several different hooks that you can use, but the state hook is really a great one to get a good idea for how beneficial it can be to actually work with hooks. So we're going to create this whole thing from scratch. And at the end of the live session, I'll actually give you some information on how you can get this source code that we're going to be coding up. So you're welcome to code along with me if you'd like, but I'll also show you how to get this source code so you can review it and make use of it in your own applications. So we'll give it a second here to download. It actually doesn't usually take this long to download. So give it a second here. In addition to the state hook, there are other hooks, for example, the callback hook, which can be used to optimize the creation of new callback functions so that you can reduce the number of re-renders of subtrees in your components by not always producing a new function reference that's passed down. There's also the effect hook, which can be used to run code when the component first comes to life or when the component gets unmounted or when other variables and stuff change. There's also a hook for setting up refs. There's a hook for setting up context. And ultimately what you're going to find with hooks is that it really allows you to create reusable state logic that can be used across many components. When you worked with class-based components, setting that up was a little bit tricky. In fact, within the React documentation, it talks about their 3 motivations for creating hooks, and the ability to create that reusable stateful logic was one of those motivations. So you're actually going to see that demonstrated here in the code that we're going to be coding up. So let's go ahead now and let's fire up. Actually, I don't want to open up in that folder. What I want to do is actually change into the hooks demo folder and then open up my Visual Studio Code. So let's drag that over here to this window so you can see that. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to do a quick little demonstration of creating a form using a class, and then we'll create a version of that form using hooks, and then we'll create a third version of that form using a custom hook. And then I'll show you how you can use custom hooks to create that reusable state logic. So let me adjust my microphone here a little bit. Okay, let's go ahead and write some code to do this. So right now, underneath source, we have this index.js file, and right now it's referring to app. But what I'm going to do is underneath source, I'm going to create a new folder here called components. And inside of this folder, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this my class form.js. And so we're going to create an actual form here with classes. But before I actually code it, let me come back over to index. I'm going to take out some code here that we don't need. We'll get rid of all that. Up here at the top, I'll go ahead and import my class form. And we'll go to components, and we'll say class form. There we go. And then what I'm going to do is simply just take class form here. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this in a fragment. And the reason why I'm going to wrap it in a fragment is because we'll be having some additional forms that will drop in here underneath of it. There we go. Okay, so there's going to be our example of a form built with a class. So let's come over here to class form and let's go ahead and start putting this together. So we're going to say import React from React, export class form, extends React.component. As you can see, I prefer to use named imports and exports. A lot of demos out there that you'll see use default imports and exports. Whatever your preferences is fine. I just happen to prefer doing the named imports and exports. So there's my class form. And what I'm going to want to do now is I'm going to want to set up some state. Now, when you go to set up this state, you can either do it as a state property on this object inside the constructor, or you can use the little bit hackish JavaScript class properties, which are basically provided to us through the use of a Babel plugin. I'm going to stick with just standard JavaScript on this one instead of using any of the extra little plugins that are included for us in Babel. So I'm going to put a constructor in here. I'm going to receive our props. I'm going to call the super constructor with the props that I receive. Then I'm going to come in here and set up some state. And we're going to build a very simple form. It's going to collect a first name and it's going to collect a last name. So we'll initialize our state like that. Now, in order to collect this data, we're going to have a change event handler that will actually collect the data from the input field as we're typing. And then we'll also need a function to output that information that we've collected by clicking a button. So I'm first going to create a change function here first. And we're just going to follow kind of the classic React pattern here. There's nothing super unique or special about the next few lines of code. We're going to say this.setState, and we're going to do e.target.name. And then we're going to come into here and we'll say e.target.value. Because I'm only going to be working with string data, I'm not going to worry about checking for numbers and stuff like that. We'll just set the value. Now down here, we're going to need to have some type of function to actually output the information. So we'll just say display form. And for this, I'm simply just going to do console.log this.state. And that'll actually have all of my form data on it. Now, as you know from working with class-based components, if I go to pass these functions as event handlers into my actual React components, when they get invoked, you're going to lose the value of this. And that has to do with the way that the value of this works for functions in JavaScript, non-arrow functions in JavaScript. It uses something called callCycThis, which is all tied into how properties are looked up, how prototype inheritance works. We're not going to go into that 3-hour-long esoteric discussion on JavaScript content, on JavaScript knowledge. But what we are going to do is we're going to avoid the error by coming up here and saying this.change is equal to this.change.bind this. In fact, yesterday I was teaching an actual React class online for a customer. And I actually did walk them through some of the esoteric knowledge to actually understand what these two lines of code are doing. And after we walked through it, they were like, wow, that was a lot of information you had to know to simply be able to make the event handlers work. One nice thing is when we switch over to hooks, you don't have to know any esoteric JavaScript knowledge to make that work. So now all class-based components, as you know, have to have a render method. The render is what's going to return basically back the React element tree that's going to be used to render it out to the screen. So we'll say return, and we're going to have our form. There we go. Now on our form, we're just going to set up two little input fields here. We'll have a label, first name, and then we'll come down here and say input type equal to text. And we'll have ID, and we'll say first name input. We'll semantically connect the ID there to our label, HTML4. There we go. Always good to follow best practices, even during a demo. So type equal to text, ID first name. We're going to give this a name of first name. The reason why we need to do the name equal to first name is because we're going to be using this name property here on e.target.name to generate the value for our computed property. So in order to have that value available to update the state with the field we're typing into, we have to specify this proper attribute here. We'll say value for this.state.firstName. And then finally, we'll have our onChange, which will then reference this dot, let's see here, change. All right, now, there we go. So we'll have to duplicate this right here and create a second form field for the actual last name. We'll scroll down there a little bit. So we have last name, and then we have last name, and we have last name, and come on down to here, last name. Okay, great. So now we've got our last name input. We'll go ahead now and set up a button here. We'll say type equal to button. If you don't do type equal to button, you'll actually have to do like an e.prevent default or whatever in your display form, but I'm not even going to mess with that. By setting the type equal to button, that will cause the button to not try to submit the form up to the server. For the on click, we'll say this dot display form, and then here we'll come in and we'll go ahead and say display person info. And that's really just going to display it on the console, just so we can see the collected data. So now we've got our form, we've got our value, our onChange, we've got our binding taken care of, our states initialized. This looks good. Let's see here. I think the only thing I really kind of want to change about it, to be honest with you, I'm famous for always refactoring my code. I name something one way and then I want to change it up to something else. And because this is all live, we're literally doing this on the fly. So I think what I want to do is I want to change this from class form to actually just call it person form, which is really what it's doing, collecting person data. And I'm going to call it person form class. That way we'll know that it was created here with a class, which means I want to take that name. I want to come back over to my components file and rename it. There we go. And then I'll hop over to index and I'll go ahead and rename it over here as well. And now I'll feel better about that. And then we'll call the next one person form hook. And that way we'll be able to tell the difference between them. So now that I've got that coded up, the next step is I need to actually run the application and fix any bugs or typos that we might have. So I'll come down here to my terminal window. I'm going to say npm start. We'll fire this up, see if we have any typos or bugs. And of course it opens up in the window in my other screen here. Let me drag that over. Okay, cool. So now we've got our actual application. Let me open up my DevTools over here. Cool. Okay, so now coming back over here, I'm going to type in my first name and last name, or I'll type in somebody's first name and last name. We'll say Bob Smith. You can see I can type into the fields, and if I click display person info, I get the person info over here just like that. So there's first name Bob, last name Smith. Everything worked as expected, as you would expect in a class-based component. Now, before we switch this over to using hooks, there's really nothing wrong with this code. This code works perfectly fine. It does exactly what you want it to do when working with React. But the problem is when you go to create your next form, most of the time what people do is they just copy and paste this whole thing and then make a few changes to it and then start creating their second form. There's really no official or best practice way to share things like the change function and stuff like that across many different components. So what we're going to do now is we're going to switch this over to using the state hook. So we'll right click here and say copy. And I'm going to paste this in here like this. And we're going to rename this file to be, person form hook. And so now we'll use a hook for this. So now coming into person form hook, we're going to start making some changes. The first thing I'm going to do is up here at the top, I'm going to pull in the use state hook. So that'll pull in the use state. Then I'm going to come down here and change this to be a functional component. You can only use hooks inside of functional components. And I'm going to rename that to be person form hook. And then we'll go ahead and set up our function to look like this. Now, I prefer to use arrow functions for my functional components. You'll see a lot of demonstrations out there using keyword style functions. That's totally fine. Both of them work equally well. I just prefer to use the arrow functions. So now what I want to do is I want to set up my state here so that I can use the state hook. So we'll say const person form set person form equal to use state, and then we're going to take our initial state and pass it in. This initial state is only used on the actual initial render. And so what will happen is person form will represent our state data, and set person form is a function. Now what this is using is something called array destructuring. So the use state hook returns back an array where the first item is your data, the second item is the function that's used to update the data and trigger the re-render. So it not only updates the data, but it also triggers the re-render in the same way that setState does for class-based components. Now I can get rid of all this constructor code. I don't need that. For my change, I'm going to change this to be an arrow function. There we go. That's fine, except for now instead of setState, I'm going to have set person form. Also, I need to make sure that I capture all of the person form data for the other properties that I've collected already. setState does emerge automatically. When you use set person form, you need to copy those properties over. For display form, we'll say const display form equal arrow. And for this, we're simply just going to put in person form. So now I've got two event handler functions. I've got my state set up. Notice I didn't have to do the bind. I didn't need a constructor. I didn't have to call the super constructor. It's all actually a lot less code and actually a little bit easier to understand, especially if you're not a JavaScript expert. So now I'm going to come down here. When you work with functional components, there's no separate render method. You just simply come in and have your elements that you return back. We do need to modify the references here to this.state and this.change. This here is now going to be person form, and the change is just simply going to be, well, change. And then down here, this will also be person form. And then we're going to have change like that. So we have person form. Perfect. There we go. Now what we're going to do is we're going to come into here and we're going to change this just to be simply be display form. There we go. So there's our display form. Now what I want to do is I want to come in and actually utilize this person form hook inside of our index.js. But what I'm going to do before I do that is one little thing here. I'm just going to put an H2 and we're going to call this person form hook. And then I'm going to copy that, paste that down into here like this. And I'm going to change this to be person form class. This way we can see both of them and we'll know which form is which. So coming back over to index, I'm going to import person form hook. And then we'll take person form hook and we're going to pop that in there like this. Looks good. Now let's head back over to our web browser and let's go ahead and try out person form hook. So I'm going to type in Bob again and Smith, display person info. I've collected the same piece of information. Now let's do a quick little comparison here between the two and kind of identify the good and the bad. So here's person form hook. That's what we created. And let's take a look here. So first of all, you're going to notice that the actual class is longer. Now, of course, we can put a certain number of line breaks and put stuff on the same line, so on and so forth, to make things shorter or longer in terms of source code. But since I've coded these things to be pretty much identical and I haven't done any crazy stuff to try to shorten or lengthen anything, it's kind of interesting to note that the actual hook implementation is in fact shorter. So it is actually less coding you have to do overall. Number two, to use person form hook, all you have to know is the use state API and just understand what it returns. And then the rest of it is just normal function writing and then referring to those functions in your element tree. Over here for the class, I actually had to know more about JavaScript. I had to understand about how to inherit. I had to understand the constructor, how to call the super. I actually had to know some things that were maybe not quite as clear in React, like for example, the special state property here. Or the special function called setState. I don't really know where these come from. I mean, ultimately, setState comes from React.component, but I don't really know where these come from. Whereas over here, once I import useState, I know exactly where this data and where this function come from. They come from the invocation of useState itself. Over here in the class-based approach, I had to basically know that I needed to solve a problem with the value of this and do this whole binding operation in order for this code to work. And like I said, to fully understand what's going on here is like a 3-hour rabbit trail of diving into basically learning a bunch of esoteric JavaScript knowledge. Now down here for the render method part, I had to have an extra method to do the render. And then inside of all of this code, I have all these references to this dot. Now, you can do a little bit of destructuring, for example, on the state up here and have independent first and last name variables, which would, maybe make it a little easier to read down here. But constantly referring to this dot, this dot, this dot just really kind of pollutes the actual code. Whereas over here, we just simply have simple functions to work with. So I think overall, setting things up with a hook actually results in easier to read and understand and manage code, and actually reduces the number of JavaScript things you have to know about. Now, if this was the end of the story, it would just be two alternatives. But what if we could actually more easily reuse this logic? For example, let's say over here in display form, in addition to displaying it, I actually wanted to reset it. So let's say I came in here and said this.setState, and then I'll go ahead and reinitialize it to the initial values here. And of course, if I wanted to do the same thing over here, I'd have to call setPersonForm, put that right here, and then I'd have to pass in the initial. And that would, of course, then reset the form. So, apples to apples comparison. So what I want to do now is I want to set this up so that I can reuse things like the reset operation, things like the change. I want to set that up so I can reuse it across multiple forms. So what we're going to do is we're going to close this, and I'm going to close that, and close that, and close that. And then I'm going to come over to here, and I'm actually going to create a new folder under source called hooks. Inside of here, I'm going to create a new file called useform.js, and I'm going to create a custom hook that's going to be managing form data. So I'm going to say import React from React, export const useForm, and then I'm going to say initial form, and then I'll have my function here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to come back over to person form hook, and I'm going to copy and paste a little bit of code. I'm going to come into here and grab the change and the use state. So let me copy that. Then what I'm going to do is come back over here to use form, and I'm going to paste that in. Now down here, I'm going to return back an array. The first item of the array is going to be my form data itself. The second item will be a change function. And then the last item is actually going to be a reset function, which will be nothing more than calling setPersonForm with the original initial form data. There we go. So now I've got my form, change, and actually I'm going to change that not to be person form, but just to be form itself. So let's modify our code up here to actually correspond to what I've defined on line 17. So this will now become form. This will now become set form. This will now become the initial form data. For the change, I'm going to simply take set form and paste that in there like that. And then I'm going to change this to be just plain old form. So now I've got my use form hook. I'm going to actually come up to here and change that to be use state. We don't actually need React for this part, so we'll just say use state. So now I've got this reusable logic. So let's go ahead and create a second person form that's going to use the custom hook instead. So I'll copy this. I'm going to paste that in. And I'm going to say rename. And we'll say custom hook. There we go. So now up here at the top, I'm going to import this and say import use form from /hooks use form. There you go. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the use form right here. I'll come down and paste that in. The first item will still be the person form, but the second item is now going to be the change function. And the third one is going to be a reset person form. So now, because I've got a change function coming in, I can drop that out. And then because I've got this reset person form function, I can drop this piece of code out. There you go. And we'll rename the actual component here to custom hook. And because I've now got use form, I no longer need to bring in use state. So take a look at that. Now we can reuse this logic across all of our forms, which means that when later on we want to update the change function to support different data types and things like that, I can make the change in one place and it will automatically be made available to me in all of my components. So let's head over to index here real quick. Let's pull in our custom hook version. There we go. Excellent. And we'll just take this, paste this in here. And let's go and update that H2 real quick to actually say custom hook. Great. So now if we come back over here, type in Bob again, Smith, display person info, same result, everything cleared out. So if we came in and did one last little comparison, we'll take our different versions and let's grab the class one. Okay, so here's our different versions. If we come in and just do kind of a quick eyeball comparison here, you'll notice that we were able to eliminate some functionality from the class when we moved over to the hook. And then we were able to eliminate our functionality from the hook when we went over and did the custom hook. And you'll notice here, this one's about 33 lines long. Over here, this one's more like 50 lines long. So we eliminated almost half the code in this particular component by switching over to hooks and more particularly using a custom hook. So this is a really great way to go when you start working with React to move away from class-based components and over to hooks. It actually makes your life a lot easier. Okay, so if you'd like the source code to this, yesterday when we did our Twitch session, I had mentioned on our website that you can sign up for something called, you can sign up on our website down here at the bottom or on the little pop-up form. You can sign up on our mailing list, and if you sign up on the mailing list, I'll be more than happy to send you the code from today's demo.